Hey there, I'm Nicole. Welcome back. So today we are talking about short story editing. This is a follow-up on one of my videos from a while ago, which was called How to Outline Your Short Story, my 7-step process. This one is when you finish drafting it, what do you do? That is what we are going to cover. Before I get started, just a quick disclaimer, I am not a writing, editing expert, and I'm basically just going to share with you what works for me and what processes and questions that I ask myself that have really helped me go from somewhat crappy drafts to somewhat not crappy drafts. So this is step 1, write a second draft. Okay, so let's get into this. Now, with short stories, I generally do the second draft directly after the first draft. This is different than what I do with novels, because by the time I finish writing a novel, I am sick of it, I don't want to deal with it, it's been like 2.5 months, 3 months, and I want it to go away. So I put it away. With short stories, I'm not generally sick of my story when I finish it, so I feel comfortable kind of doing a second draft right away. This basically comes in filling in the bits where you wrote TK or you rushed through, figure out what things are highlighted in red, and just fill those in. The next thing I do in doing the second draft is talk about and think about character growth. These are the questions that I ask myself when I look into character growth in my short story. So the first one is there an action at the beginning that establishes the character's weakness or who they are now? Then I ask, what in the middle challenges their belief system? So their weakness is probably stemming from some sort of lie they believe or false belief or whatever. And the point of the story is some things are happening that are challenging whatever action, whatever weakness, whatever thing they've been doing that's prohibiting them from living their best life. So I try to think what in the middle is challenging this belief system. And then I ask, does it escalate? Because if it doesn't escalate, and if it's the same thing, challenging it on the same level over and over, that's repetitive and boring. Then I ask myself, can you pinpoint the moment their false belief is turned over? i.e., it's a self-revelation or a turning point brought on by some new information or a progressive complication. So the moment where they realize that they have been wrong. And then I ask, what action do they take to cement this change? You can't just say, and I've done this before, you can't just say, yes, and now they have changed, and now they believe they are XYZ. You have to take an action, have them do something that is the opposite of the action that they did at the beginning. So there's an action at the beginning that establishes their weakness. At the end, there's another action that shows that they have changed. If it's a negative arc, I change those last 2 steps to, can you pinpoint the moment their false belief should change but does not? And do you show how their actions have not changed and how this will doom them? So on a very kind of base level, if you're going into not super nuanced fashion of it, they do something at the beginning that establishes their weakness. It's challenged. They should realize it's wrong, but they don't. So then they take the same action, and you should convey to the reader that this is bad. So I will go through and I will make sure that those actions establishing and the change and the challenge and all that is present in my story. If they're not there, then in the second draft, I write them in. I add them in. If they're not strong enough, if they're not obvious enough, I make them stronger. The next thing that I ask in the second draft is the 5 commandments of story. So I am a huge story grid nerd. If you haven't heard about story grid, I have a video that kind of does a soft introduction to it. I will also link that below. As much as I have been like, oh, I also want to explore other story structures and methodologies, I am so stuck on the story grid. I started listening to the podcast 5 years ago, and nowadays I will be like, I'm just gonna edit this story, and then I'll realize, gosh, Shawn Coyne, the story grid is in my head. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it's funny. It's not for everyone, but it's definitely how I like to think about stories. So I identify the 5 commandments in a scene, which is, are they there? And if they're there, are they working? The 5 commandments are the scene has to have an inciting incident, progressive complications, including a turning point progressive complication, which is a progressive complication your character was not expecting that changes the value or the way the scene is going. Then there's a crisis, so the turning point, progressive complication, kind of like your character thinks you're going to zig, the turning point progressive complication zags, and your character has to make a decision at the crisis point based on that. The climax, which is the result of the decision, and the resolution. I'm usually bad at the crisis and climax while I am drafting. It's usually something that's not super clear. A lot of the examples that they'll give, the crisis is like, do I give them the spy plans or do I not and die? And like, that's a really obvious crisis. Whereas in short stories, the ones that I write, it's always like, does she get the strength to go do it on her own, or does she wait for someone else? Like, you see what I mean? It's not as external so much as it's an internal crisis, so it's harder to figure out. Anyways, when I figure out that I have no crisis or climax, I brainstorm ways to fix it up. I brainstorm different crises, different decisions that they can make, and the implications from these better, and I just try to better define those moments. So rewriting, adding things in here and there to make sure that I hit those 5 commandments. Once I do that, I might fix a little bit of the little issues on voice or characters, but generally it's character development and the 5 commandments I really focus on in the second draft. And then my step number 2 is I leave it there. I leave it, and while I leave it for a few months, a few weeks, whatever, I try to get feedback on it in that time. Ideally more than one opinion. This is why I really like Scribophile. I have a video on that too for beta reader feedback. It's great. I find it super helpful. Step 3. 3 months later, I reread the story 3 times. The first time I read it as a reader, I read it all the way through, and after I make notes kind of on my impressions and what I thought overall as a reader of the story. Number 2, I reread while reading the beta reader's notes at the same time. So I'll do the thing in Microsoft Word where I copy in the beta reader's notes in comments. So I reread and then read the beta reader comments as I read the story to see if I agreed, to see if they matched with my notes, and to get the different perspectives. And then I read a 3rd time, reread it a 3rd time with those ideas in mind, thinking of the beta reader feedback, and make notes on all the changes that need to be implemented. As I am reading, I revisit the 5 commandments, and then I try to think of the value shifts. So how does the story change on a positive, neutral, negative scale? So when does it shift? How many times? Do we end up at a same place or a different place in the middle? Basically, if you have a story and you start out negative and you end positive, you should be like negative, either like negative, more negative, less negative, positive, or if you start positive and end positive, it should go positive, negative, positive, you know, just mapping out the value shifts. Does that make sense? Is there something that specifically shows the shift? So this is really getting into the weeds of like, how is the scene turning on a macro level beyond just character development into the mood and the values that are at stake in the story? That's when I'm doing my own reads. When I'm rereading beta reader feedback, I think a lot about character development. Again, same questions from draft number 1, but then I go more into extraneous detail. What doesn't really need to be here? What is making the point murky? I love it when beta readers are like, I don't understand what's going on, because then you can be like, all right, we can just delete that part or whatever. And then where is more information needed? I also look for beta reader feedback on where is the action or structure or dialogue cliche, where is it awkward, is there a strong voice, and where do we lose the voice? These are all the questions that I'm asking myself, and then based on those questions, I make those notes. So some of the notes that I have on changes that need to be made are, here's just an example from one story. Make the bar discovery the inciting incident of the scene, so change the inciting incident. Maybe 2 calls with the mother. It's not about her finding out thing X, she knows. It's about her realizing just how bad things are. Preachy, question mark, better ending needed, and earlier, question mark. That was all for one short story. In a different short story in the same series, my notes were, maybe tighten up the beginning, not too much to do here beyond line edits. So I will obviously spend a lot more time on the first story than the second story. Then, after I have the notes of things that I need to do, I go to step 4, which is decide the extent of the edits. My draft 3s can be pretty different from draft 2. So, for example, in my Christmas short story anthology, I decided to delete 1 short story and add in 3 totally new ones because I decided that 2 stories needed minor structural edits, just things that don't make sense or were annoying for the readers. For example, in 1, I mentioned a lot of Christmas carols, and every single reader commented on it. Like, one of them was positive, 2 of them were negative, which just, since everybody commented on it, I was like, that is way more visible than it should be. In the same story, I also have a lot of people carrying boxes, and that's causing a lot of problems because I keep losing track of the boxes, and I'm like, this can't happen, like they can't move there because they're holding all these boxes, so I'm deleting the boxes from the story. It's just a very simple fix. They don't need to have all those boxes. But those are like the minor edits that I'm making in 2 of my stories. And then 2 of my stories need major structural edits. And I figured that out because my readers commented on things such as, this doesn't make sense, no one would act like this, I don't understand why she does this before that, cliche, I knew where this was going, this is like every after school special ever, that one hurt a little bit, and this isn't very Christmassy, etc. So I decided I didn't want to completely scrap those ones, but I did have to change the fundamental structure and the events of those stories based on that feedback. So reordering the events, brainstorming stuff to make it not cliche, and so on. That brings me to step 5, which is no matter what stage you are on, but especially for me for draft 3, I get a blank document. I avoid copying and pasting. I have the document open in another window, the original, and I type the text myself, even if it's exactly the same. I will make a ton of changes as I do this. It is hard to make myself do this because I'm like, I don't want to change that. I like that. I don't want to retype it. But when I do retype it, it helps the story a lot. So at that point, I am typing out and making my changes to draft 3. And draft 3 is finished. After draft 3 is finished, I go to solicit more beta reader feedback. This I prefer not to get from Scribophile if possible. I mean, I can go there too, but actual people to give me really good beta reader feedback, and that propels me into step 7, which is the 4th draft. I have not brought in a lot of things to 4th draft, but basically my plans for this and what I've done with certain stories in the past is really narrowing in on the voice, cleaning up small things with the story structure, based on the beta reader feedback, going into pacing, going into voice. And then 8 is line edits, maybe more beta readers, just sort of tweaking, perfecting to make it as good as humanly possible. So that is my rather convoluted, lots of information short story editing process that I realize relies a lot on beta readers because they're so important. The couple key takeaways, I guess, in terms of if I can summarize it up, is I don't think getting beta readers is worthwhile until after the 2nd draft, at least for me. The first ones are always a mess and they generally don't perfectly align with my intentions for the story. So the 2nd draft, I get my intentions for the story solidified. So it is more of the story that I wanted to tell. When I get beta reader feedback on that, they're giving me feedback on my intentions of how good the story I actually wanted to write is, so then I can change that for draft 3. Draft 1 is just a whole mess of who knows what. So I hope this was helpful. Please tell me, what is your editing process like? What are the similarities and differences with mine? Is there anything, any sort of questions that you ask yourself that I missed? Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. I don't know what this is. Bye guys. As I explained, maybe put the notes right now. Put the notes here.